Okay, time to dimension the landscape site plan in Revit. I got a pretty basic site plan here, just some stuff for me to work with to show you guys this. Um, but let's run through all of our dimensioning, and we're going to find most of what we need here on the Annotate tab. But a lot of this is going to work very differently from how you might be used to doing it in AutoCAD, but there's just a few tricks. As with everything in Revit, it takes more time up front to set things up, but it saves you time later. All right, so let's start with the most straightforward one, dimensioning lengths and distances. So we have a few dimensions here, our aligned, our linear, and our arc length. Right? So um, we're gonna start by trying to dimension like the distance across this road. I've got it set up as a floor. Now I can click here and I can pretty much drag that dimension anywhere, and it doesn't much matter where I click. This is going to act really similar to how we're used to acting, things behaving in AutoCAD. Okay, right. This one's struggling a little bit to find what to click on, mostly because I have a bunch of different floors here. So I might need to cycle through tab, right? And if it doesn't end up working for you, there's some things we can also do. Like if you just can't select, that happens. One of the easiest things we can do is add a point. So add 2 points opposite each other, exactly where we want that dimension to be. Okay, and now we have to hover around and hunt for it, but it'll usually attach right to it. If it's not, it might be because I've got a couple floors floating. You can see here I've got a couple floating floors. Actually, one's hidden in this view. So this might be a source of your problem also is, I've got a couple different elements floating above each other just for visibility in my materials plan. But that you can work that out with some troubleshooting. But more or less, there's always a reason why your dimension isn't attaching. The ones where you're trying to measure distance here along a line are much trickier. Usually the distance from one line to another parallel line works pretty easily in Revit. But you see, I'm struggling to just get this to land. And the reason for that is Revit really only wants to dimension those um, type of dimensions along a line wherever there are points. Okay, so you can see I've got some lines set up here. I might set up some others. Each of those needs a point in order for me to be able to click it. Right, and so now if I have a sense of where those points are, it makes it a lot easier for me to click and hunt for that point, and then I can easily pull that dimension off. Okay, and go in here again and do another one just to my next point. Now we want to go in and edit the styles for these dimensions so that our dimensions for the site plan are in feet and whole inches. We don't need fractional inches usually. So we'll click here in our Annotate tab. Under Dimension, there's this drop down, and we'll go to Linear Dimension Types. There's many things we can change about the appearance of that dimension, but I want to go down to my primary units, click on my units format, and uncheck Use Project Settings. I'm going to keep it at feet and fractional inches, although there's many other options. And I'm just going to do it to the nearest inch. And so you can see that all of my dimensions now have simplified to just feet and full inches. And any further dimensions I draw will do the same. So that's our linear dimensions. We'll do one here just to keep track of where we're at. Okay. So the next one we want to work with is our arc length. So for any arc, we need to dimension that length. And so I'll go ahead and click on that tool. I'll select an arc, and then Revit gives me a no symbol, which can trick you into thinking that you've done something wrong, that the tool's not going to work on this arc. But that's not true. Here's how it works. We click on it and we get that no symbol. Revit simply wants us to click on the endpoints for that arc before we can do anything further. Right? So when you get that no symbol, Don't be dissuaded. Again, just click, find the starting and end points of that arc and pull out your dimension. And you'll notice that because this is a linear dimension, it follows the same setup as we set for these straight lines. All right, so the next type of dimension we might want to draw is one that kind of cuts across here, right? And we'll find that that's a struggle. All right, we can't get it to land. Now, if we add points to our floor, right, for example, let's add a point here and a point here. That might be problematic for us. It might work fine, right? But it can also, you see how you'll notice how it triangulated our face more, and we may not want that to happen for a variety of reasons, but it might be fine. So we can certainly select these points and try to pull something off of it, right? A dimension like that. And it'll usually work, but sometimes it hides or sometimes it just won't land again. Right? It can be tricky to pull these types of dimensions off. So the way to do it that's most commonly used is actually to create some detail lines wherever you want to pull these dimensions out. Right. So I'm going to do a couple of these over here. Doesn't really matter how heavy they are. I'm just going to keep them heavy here just for ease of visibility. So now whenever I have a detail line, I ought to be able to dimension it fairly easily. Actually, let me make these just a little bit lighter, just so you can see more of what's going on. All right, so I'd like to use these detail lines to dimension, but again, it still doesn't really grab them. So that can be frustrating, but it's easy to fix. In fact, you can use this anytime you're trying to dimension things in Revit and it won't quite find it. You see I zoom in here and tab to cycle through objects. And when I get that blue dot, I want to click, right? It's now selected that as the first point. And we can do it also here. Right? As soon as it gets that, I can pull my dimension off of there. Okay, I'll do the same thing over here. Right, so hover my mouse until I get a blue dot while I click tab. And I usually have to do it at the end. Right, I can pull that off there. So now you might say, okay, so now I don't need these lines anymore. But because Revit is an object-based software, all the data that it displays is attached to these objects, like these lines. So we can't delete them. If we delete them, the annotation leaves with it. So the way it workaround is to create a white line and apply it to these line style. That way it sort of hides that helper line. So we'll go to Manage, Additional Settings, and we'll go into our line styles here. And we're going to make a new line, and we can call it White Hidden. So now we've got that, and all we need to do is click here, and we can click white. The other thing is, right, we might choose another line type, but there's no reason to. You just really need to click white. Okay, so now we have a new line style. Now we have to set these lines. Hold down Control to click both. And now under our line style at the very bottom, we have our hidden white line. So now when I unclick off those lines, they're gone. They're actually there, right? So if I change my style here to shaded, like you can see those lines, they're very thin. Right? So they're not actually gone. But if we have a black and white drawing like we would for a construction drawing, then they're essentially going to be hidden. Again, you can still select them, you can still delete them. The annotation deletes with it, but this is the workaround. All right, other linear dimensions. So sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we have an object that is kind of floating in the middle of our design and it's irregular. And often it has arcs and splines associated with it. And those are tougher to dimension using sort of the traditional techniques of distance from one thing to another. We do something a little different for this. Right, so the first thing you see, I've got 2 points here, one right on top of each other. I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a detail line that goes between these 2 points. And just for ease of visibility, I'm going to do this like a dashed green line. Okay. This is going to be our center line upon which we are going to establish some other dimensions. Right, so we would want to dimension the distance from here to here. That might go with a different detail line, right, but that'll come later. So now I'm going to add a second detail line here. In fact, I'm going to move this over so that it's at my highest point here. And snap that in here. I'm going to pull this line out. And so it's a little easier to see everything, I'm going to also make it dashed green. And then I'm going to pull this other endpoint out all the way. So what I want is for both of these lines to go outside of the edges of my little object here. So now what I want to do is I want to have a series of these lines copied. Right? And what this will let me do is establish linear dimensions at established intervals. So I'll click here, right, and I'll go in and I'm going to array this. Okay. So I have some choices, like I can either click the first and the last point of my array and it'll fill in the rest, kind of even spacing, or I can click my first and my second point with some control over the spacing and it'll array the rest. So I got to think a little bit. I'm going to guess that I need like 8 lines. And then I'll click on the first part of my array, and then I want to drag down to something really easy, like round numbers, like 10. So the distance between all of these is now 10 feet. There's my array. So I think I can go in and dimension this here. I'm not sure. Yeah, so it'll let me. Okay, so first of all, we can establish that dimension. And I don't know, it's not letting me. Also, easy to just keynote this, perhaps, and say 10 feet between this, or I could just put text over here. Right. It might be easier than just dimensioning that. Okay, so now I actually need to go in here, and first, what I want to do is I want to actually pull these in. So I could trim these, or it's sometimes easier to just ungroup these. Right, so I can edit the whole group. Yeah, I'll just go in and ungroup these all. Right. Except for the one that I already did. So now these are just individual lines, not part of a grouped array. I don't need this one. I can take this one here and actually just snap it to the edges here. So now we'll keep these. And these will now sort of follow the shape of this. And we can go in and actually, with our snapping, really make sure these touch. So I would do that for all of these. Go down here and pull these all in first. Be really careful where they touch. And I actually want to keep these in my final drawing. Right? In my construction document, you actually want to see these lines because they're indicators of how you've pulled your dimensions off here. So now I can go in, and just the same as with everything else that I've been doing, I can go in, right, and I can pull a dimension off that. And we actually want to keep these lines, right? Because they give us an indication of at every 10 feet what that dimension is. And that's sort of a typical way in a landscape layout plan. What's going on here? In a landscape layout plan, to show dimensions of an irregular object, like a planting bed or something, while also establishing its distance. Right, so here We may not be able to successfully dimension this. You might need a second detail line, and this might be like a white helper line, right? Because this doesn't have a point that we can click to here. So this seems like a lot of work. It's not that much work, though, at the end of the day, once you get used to it. So, right, so now I can pull that off and choose this detail line and make it a hidden white line. Right. So now we know that we measure from here 7 feet. The other thing we'll need to do for this floor is add a point here, right where that line hits, right? And now we'll pull in a line dimension right off here. Hitting tab to that point. We'll pull it over here. So now we have some other key dimensions. We don't need this, right? We know this distance, we know this distance down, and then we know that this is every 10 feet, and we can measure across, right? And we might further actually want to just copy these lines. We might want to dimension it on either side, right? This is how the contractor is going to lay this out. So what we can do here is I can actually take each of these lines. Let's just take a few of these, right? And I can copy them here. And then I can go and paste, and I want to align them to the same place. Now we have two versions of these lines. Okay. I can take one, pull it to here, and I can take the other one, this line, just hitting tab to click that line, and I can pull it over here. All right, and I would do the same thing down here with these copies. Now I have two different detail lines. Right, so I can go in. I can dimension these pretty easily. Pretty hard to see what I'm getting here. Awesome. So making sure that I'm hovering over here. Has no interest in what I'm doing right now. We'll start over here, it's easy. And see what we can get for something to click on. I don't know. There we go. So that took a little work, but you'll get used to it, right? So now we can see these dimensions here, right? And there's another one in there that I put in by mistake somehow. Okay, so now we can see the distance here and the distance on this side. So the contractor is going to measure out 101 feet, 7 feet and 6 inches to here, 7 feet down. They're going to lay out something to space it every 10 feet. And then from the middle, they're going to lay some string out, right? 11 feet 1 inches and 15 feet 5 inches. And then they're going to figure out that arc between there. You can't exactly dimension or these as arcs, right? It's not going to work. Not going to find these. These are splines, right? So it's not going to be able to pull that radial information off of it because I drew these when I made my floor, right? So I went in here, and this is very common. I use this spline tool. Sometimes if I draw it differently in AutoCAD and I use that line work and bring it in, it'll accept some of the Revit annotations a little bit more easily. But this should be enough, though. This should be enough, right? You'd want to go check that before it starts getting built, but it should be enough. And then, of course, with our array, we have equal spacing. Down here, we've got something a little less regular. So we would draw a little detail line here, right? And we might also draw one from the center of this line up. And we dimension it down to here, and we'd also pull a dimension off here. So that's how we'll deal with this kind of geometry. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our arcs, right, and our angles. So one thing that's easy in Revit, angular dimensions. If you're used to AutoCAD, this is going to work exactly the same way. Don't really need to change much, but if you did want to go in and change your angular dimension types, add or remove a decimal place, you could always do that. The default of 2 decimal places are the standard for our landscape site plan. Okay, last thing, the radii of our curves. All right, so this is going to help with, again, with installation. It's going to give us a point to establish the distance for this radii of these curves. So first, let's go into our settings here. And our units, so again, we have way too detailed. Again, this is meant for architecture and precision down to, like the 64th of the inch sometimes. But for site work, we need whole inches and feet most of the time, right? So we'll do it to the nearest inch. So now when we set up our radius, you can see we can click anywhere on that arc. I don't know why sometimes it wants this. Okay, we'll try a different one. It wants me to move it around. Okay. Oh, it's going to help to be in wireframe in this case because I've got lots of different floors and levels and stuff. So now you notice that when I click somewhere, we've got a point. It measures that radius. This helps with layout, right? We can establish this point. Simple thing like if we want to click on that point and then dimension it to there, we would probably, if we wanted to establish where this point is, we could probably pull some distances off here, and we would use, I think, detail lines for that. Right. But always can pull these in or out to established areas. Like you can pull these in a little bit if you want to just change the length of that line. It'll keep that point there. So it should be pretty clear where that radius is taken from. Okay. Let's see. That's pretty much it for our dimensions. There's a couple other things to know. Like, okay, right, we can always double click on a dimension, and we can change what it says. Right. So, when would we want to do that? Let's say we have 2 dimensions coming off the same thing. I don't know. It happens sometimes. A lot of times it details. Right, so we'll pull, oops, wrong kind. Right, we'll pull a dimension off here. And then we might do a second. Right. So we can double click on the text, and instead of its actual value, we might have like 2 types of something that we refer to in our details. So we'll have to type in the dimension ourselves, right? I can just actually copy that. So sometimes we might want to actually have some more control over our text. All right, so the only other thing to talk about is if we have, we want to have like a coordinate position somewhere. Let me quickly draw something. Always good to save. Now we have floor out here, and in this scenario, it's pretty easy to dimension it off of other things like the architecture, but you might find yourself in a position where, for various reasons, there's established points on all drawings where you need to put coordinates, or we need to put a coordinate for this corner, and it may, for various reasons, be too difficult to locate with typical dimension lines. Or we may just want to mark, again, these established points in the drawing. But let's say we're going to mark right here with coordinates. So we can always just annotate them with text, of course. But if we have located our project with sort of an established base point with other projects, like the architect's project or the civil engineer's project, we have already established the real world geospatial location of this model. In which case, going to our annotate tab here, and setting a spot coordinate is pretty easy. Right? So we could click here, just pull a leader off. Right? Let's actually use Revit to place our project in the real world. So we'll go to Manage and Location. And we can actually find where this project is. And so you can either type in our address or you can just hunt around for it. But you need to pick a place in the real world existing conditions where this point in your project is going to exist. Okay, so we take this home and we'll drag it to wherever it needs to be. This is not the preferred method of setting up your coordinates, but it is one way. Like in our case, we didn't have a survey, so we needed to set this up some other way. So we can actually drag this to like the corner of something. Very accurate. We'll say okay. All right. So now we'll go in and we'll annotate our spot coordinate here. Right. And this is pretty similar to what we had set up. Our home point wasn't far from that. All right. For our coordinates, we want to have them read a little bit differently. So we're going to go into our spot coordinate types. And for our units, we're going to use US survey feet. And it's pretty typical with a landscape plan to set it up to something like 4 decimal places. So we're just going to change our rounding increment. Right? So now we have our northing and our easting. Can change, one thing if we want under the type that you might want it to say equals after it. So you can change that over here. Right, so now this sets up our spot coordinate right here with northing and easting in your US survey feet and inches. Okay, that's really all there is to it. Good luck.